Hello everybody and welcome back to the second shelf. I'm a week late with this video, I know. The to be released video, TBR, the new releases in February, a video that I make at the beginning of each month when I look at the new releases and pick a few that I personally find interesting. And it was supposed to happen last Sunday, but the combination of house guests and deadlines and migraine just didn't equal filming video. So I'm sorry about that. But the good news is that most of the books that I want to talk to you about have already been released by now, most of them on the 5th of February. So let's get right into it. And as always, we start off with literary fiction. And for this category, I picked Yi-Yun Lee, Where Reason Ends. And that's one of the books that already has been published on the 5th of February. If you're not familiar, Yi-Yun Lee is a Chinese-American author. She was born 1972 in China, but she moved to the United States in her mid-20s and has lived in the US ever since, and she writes in English. I know Yi-Yun Lee's work mostly from her short story collections. So if you're into short stories, I can, for example, recommend Gold Boy, Emerald Girl. I think it's about 10 years ago, this collection. And she also writes a nonfiction memoir. Her memoir about her depression and her suicide attempt was published in 2017. I write from my life to your life. But the new book, Where Reason Ends, is fiction, although it's based on Yi-Yun Lee's own life. Because Yi-Yun Lee lost one of her two children, one of her sons, to suicide. And she writes in the book, she composes a letter. So the narrator in the book is a mother who just lost her son, Nikolai, to suicide, the same age as Yi-Yun Lee's son was, 16. And she writes letters in order to try to, in a way, preserve his life, to bring him back to life. I don't know much more about the book, but because I really like Yi-Yun Lee's work, and I find the topic very interesting is not the right word for a book about, the suicide of a young man, but you know what I mean. And her writing has always enthralled me. So Yi-Yun Lee's book, Where Reason Ends, is my pick for literary fiction to be released in February. And I just realized, I said for Yi-Yun Lee's book that the mother writes letters to her dead son. That's not true. It's fictional conversations. So the mother, the protagonist of the book, imagines conversations with her dead son. Anyway, moving on to nonfiction. And this time I chose two essay collections. And the first one is Janet Malcolm's new collection, Nobody's Looking at You, will be published on the 19th of February. Now, Janet Malcolm, you're probably familiar with her work, at least if you read nonfiction and essays. She was born in 1934 in Prague, but she moved with her parents to the United States when she was very little, I think 2 or 3. She has been a writer for The New Yorker. She writes nonfiction biographies. She wrote biographies of Gertrude Stein, for instance, and Sylvia Plath, but also Anton Chekhov. And she, I think one of her most famous works is The Journalist and the Murderer, a controversial long essay on a journalist who reported on a true crime case, and that one was published, I think, in the beginning of the 1990s. But anyway, the new collection, as always, covers a wide range of subjects. She looks at people, but also situations. So it's not only literary criticism, if you are wondering, but it's more political essays. And I really like her style, the way she crafts essays, the way she looks at things. So I'm really excited about this new release. Nobody's looking at you, Janet Malcolm, 19th of February. And the second essay collection is one you probably have seen because it has been going around on BookTube, and that is Esme Wei-Jun Wang, the Collected Schizophrenias. And that one has already been published also on the 5th of February. Now, Esme Wei-Jun Wang is an American author, and she is a novelist and essayist. She's what we call mental health advocate. Her debut novel, 2015, I believe, The Border of Paradise, received quite some accolades, and she was named by Granta as one of the 20 best new novelists or best new writers in the US. But anyway, her collection is a very personal collection about her own illness. She has been diagnosed with schizophrenic disorder, and as from what I understood and from the bits and pieces that I read in the collection, it's essays not only about her experience of the illness, but also her way, to the diagnosis, about the medical community. And I'm always really interested in medical issues, and especially mental health issues. So this collection, as a somebody who has personally experienced or is personally experiencing this type of illness, I'm really looking forward to it. The next book, we move back to fiction, but this time historical fiction and a debut novel. If you're following my channel, that I'm always looking for new authors and try to find at least one debut each month that I want to read. And for February, I picked Whitney Shara, The Age of Light, which came out on the 5th of February. Whitney Shara is an American author born in Denver, but she lives in Boston now. Hey, Steve Donahue, a fellow Boston inhabitant. And The Age of Light is about the photographer Lee Miller. Lee Miller herself is also an American-born photographer. She was born in 1907, and she died 70 years later in 1977. But she moved from America to Paris to apprentice with the famous photographer Man Ray. And she started modeling first, and then she became Man Ray's apprentice and also lover. His muse, she's often called his muse, but most importantly, she became a very famous photographer in her own right. And I love Lee Miller. One of my proudest possessions is a photography by Lee Miller that is in my living room, the Paris photography. So I just love her, and the idea that somebody makes a historical fiction account of her life is really exciting to me. Lee Miller is interesting also because of the way she crafted her life from your typical quote unquote female role as a model and muse, and then she became one of the most celebrated photographers in the 20th century in her own right. I said that already. But anyway, so in The Age of Light, about Lee Miller, is a historical fiction debut that I'm really very much looking forward to. And as always, we end my TBR with sci-fi or fantasy, and mostly I pick sci-fi, but for this month I picked a fantasy, a new release, and that is Anne Leckie's The Raven Tower, which will be published at the end of the month, the 26th of February. Anne Leckie probably. She's an American author. You know her if you read sci-fi from her Imperial Raj series, Ancillary Justice, the first one. I really liked that series. I haven't read Provenance, the other sci-fi book by her that was released, I think, a year or two ago. And if you following me, you know that I don't read that much fantasy. I like Robin Hobb. I read a couple of her books in that huge 18-volume series, but I tend not to gravitate to fantasy. But it's Anne Leckie, so I'll give it a try. From what I understand, it's your typical epic fantasy. You have this kingdom of, I think, Iraden, if I pronounce that correctly, which is ruled by a king that is personally picked by the god, the Raven, and the Raven watches over this kingdom. But then, of course, things go bad, and the rightful heir to the throne needs to claim the city back, and there's a warrior, and you know, your typical fantasy stuff. Like I said, I'm not a big fantasy reader, but I like Anne Leckie's work, so I want to give this a try, and I will buddy read this with Chris from Chris Bookish Cauldron. I'll leave a link to his really wonderful channel down below, and especially if you are a fantasy reader, you should check out his channel, because he reads really a lot of fantasy, old, new, all kinds of. So if that's your thing, and you don't know Chris, you should certainly check out his channel. Anyway, we will read this in March, and I will report back in one of my recent reads videos how I did with The Raven Tower by Anne Leckie. So this was it for my belated February TBR. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my selection. As always, I'm looking forward to your comments. Let me know whether any of the books that I mentioned interest you, or maybe you have picked up one or two, the ones that have been released already, or maybe you're excited about a February release that I haven't mentioned. So let me know, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.